This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey everyone, it's Mark Baer. Welcome to another episode of When Science Speaks. Today's episode is brought to you by Baer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists and engineers get funding, gain influence, and build key relationships. We are so pleased to welcome Dr. Jonah Berger to the show today. Jonah is a professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. He's an international best-selling author, a world-renowned expert on word of mouth, social influence, consumer behavior, and how products, ideas, and behaviors catch on. Jonah's published dozens of articles in top-tier academic journals. He teaches Wharton's highest-rated online course, and popular accounts of his work often appear in places like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Harvard Business Review. Over 1 million copies of his book, Contagious, Invisible Influence, and also the latest one, The Catalyst, How to Change Anyone's Mind, are in print in over 35 countries around the world. Jonah earned his PhD in marketing from Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. It is so great to have you here. Thanks for being here, Jonah.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I just want to start by talking about your latest book, which I really enjoyed, The Catalyst. And it follows, your other best-selling books, Contagious and Invisible Influence, as I mentioned. How did you initially get interested in persuasion and decision-making?
Yeah, so at the heart, I'm a scientist, and I grew up actually in Washington D.C. Studying the hard sciences. So I went to a math, science, computer science junior high school. And high school, I thought I was going to be an environmental engineer. I got to college. I took a course about the intersection of science, technology, and society, and I started to get really interested in the sort of more what I'll call the society part, the intersection of the things. As scientists, we can build something amazing, whether it's a product or service or an idea, a new technology that is better than what's out there at the moment. But to get people to adopt that thing, it's not just about whether it's good or not. It's about whether it's something they need or about whether something it's framed in a way that they can digest and understand. And so I really started getting interested in, well, hey, how can we apply the ideas of science to understanding things like persuasion, understanding things like influence, understanding like why things catch on. And so started doing research as an undergraduate at Stanford, went and got a PhD, and now I'm a faculty member at Wharton. But I think the goal is very much the same. How can we take those rigorous tools of science, whether they're experimentation, whether they're statistics, whether that's analyzing field data sets, and apply it to understanding human behavior. I work with a lot of companies and organizations, including scientists, and I think scientists in particular, we have this notion that if the idea is good, it will succeed, right? If the content is good, if the science is right, it will be successful. And if the past few years have shown us anything, I think it's that unfortunately, it's not just about the science, right? It's not just about whether the idea is right, but about how it fits with the way people are built. When I give talks sometimes, I often ask people at the beginning, I say, hey, which of these two things is tastier, a cheeseburger or broccoli? And everyone says, oh, the cheeseburger is tastier. And one thing we talk about is, well, why is it tastier? We know we should eat fruits and vegetables, but the cheeseburger fits with the way our tongues and our stomachs are designed. Certain food is just tastier than others, even though it might not be the nutritiousest, it's the most tasty. And so we as scientists, we as individuals that want to get something to catch on, we have to take the same approach to science and ideas, right? Some ideas are going to be tastier than others, not just because they're true and not just because they're valuable, but because they fit with the way that people are designed, right? They take advantage of the way our brains are built and the way we share things and the way we make decisions. And so to be a successful scientist, to be a successful policymaker, to get an idea to catch on and spread, we can't just say, well, hey, this is really good, and so people should come around and do it or use it. We have to understand what makes ideas tasty. And I think, what's great is the past, I'll say, decade or so has seen more adoption of social science within government, within policy. That's good. I think for the most part, it's been economics, right? For the most part, it's been lots of economically based, often field studies around certain things. And economics is great, but economics doesn't tell us everything. And so I think to get things to catch on, we have to understand some of the more behavioral side of social science, and that's where psychology really comes in.
Great. And I'd love for you to delve a little bit into the science as a scientist yourself, talking about sort of some of the scientific underpinnings that you present in such a compelling way in the book.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And, so this book for me, so, I, my first book came out in 2013. That was Contagious. It changed my life. Before that, I was doing academic research. Most of the time, I'd say 97% of the time was academic research and teaching. That book came out and it sort of changed my life. Suddenly I was getting calls from governmental organizations and Google and Nike and Apple and small startups to help them apply the ideas from that book to things they were working on. And I slowly realized again and again that everyone had something in common, which is they all had something they wanted to change. Right. So, the sales and marketing folks wanted to change consumer behavior or clients' minds. Leaders wanted to transform organizations. Employees wanted to change their boss's mind. Startups wanted to change industries. Nonprofits wanted to change the world. But change is really hard, right? These companies and organizations were putting in effort, putting in work, and change wasn't happening. And so I started to wonder, could there be a better way? And that's really what kicked off the catalyst. Rather than presenting facts and figures and information, all of which are good, but how can we become better change agents, better catalysts, if you will, not by pushing harder, but by finding an alternate path to change. And so the book is really about what that alternate path is and how can we leverage it more effectively.
I want to ask you both about the application and a little bit more about the first principle that you talk about in the book. Obviously we've got intense public health efforts to try to stamp out COVID-19. Now we have a vaccine that's been approved. And so I'm thinking about government initiatives that are encouraging mask wearing and, on the horizon, messages to promote vaccination. And, one of the principles you write about in the Catalyst is reactance, which you describe as the negative feeling that people get when they're told that they should do something, wear a mask, eat your vegetables, and that often, as you point out, triggers resistance. And so as a, new federal government in the United States is posed to take office in January 20th, how should policymakers address this reactance force if the goal is to encourage, in this case, widespread mask wearing and vaccination?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And what's been interesting to me, I've obviously written this book on change. The book actually came out March 7th. So not only has it been a terrible time to release a book in the middle of a pandemic, but it's been interesting to be writing a book and sort of releasing a book around change at a time when there's so much change going in the world. But I think, to get to answering that question, I think it helps to unpack, first of all, what we mean by reactance. And I think to do that, it actually helps to tell a story from a very different domain. And that is about something that many of us, but not all, many of us have used before, which is these laundry pods that go in your washing machine called Tide Pods. And so many of your listeners are probably familiar with Tide Pods. You may use them at home, but let me tell you a little bit of a story behind them. So a few years ago, Tide, owned by Procter & Gamble, wanted to change the way that people do laundry. Doing laundry is not that difficult, but it's often hard to know exactly how much detergent to put in. It often is sticky and gets on the counter. And it actually turns out that it would be better if some of the detergent went in at the beginning of the cycle, some went in at a different part, and some went in later in the cycle. And so Tide spends a bunch of money on research development, comes up with these things called Tide Pods that solve all those problems. What are Tide Pods? They're basically these little capsules of detergent that you chuck into the laundry, and you sort of set it and forget it. You chuck it in right at the beginning. It takes care of everything. You don't have to measure anything. It dissolves the packet, and so different parts of the detergent enter different parts in the cycle. Solves all the problems. Okay, and so they spend $100 million on marketing. They think it could take a big chunk of the over $1 billion laundry industry, and they launch Tide Pods. And so Tide Pods come out. and they're doing okay, but then there's a problem, which is that people are eating them. And I want to pause there just for just a minute, because some of the folks that are listening might be going, what do you mean people are eating them? Right? Aren't they filled with chemicals? Why would people be eating something filled with chemicals? No, you're right. They are filled with chemicals. But yes, in fact, people are eating them. Okay, this was called the Tide Pod Challenge. Mostly young people were challenging one another to eat Tide Pods. There was a funny video online saying they looked good enough to eat. There was a satirical article, and suddenly, again, mostly young people were challenging one another to eat Tide Pods. And so imagine you're a Tide executive in this situation. Right? You're sitting there going, well, people shouldn't be eating these things in the first place. But just in case that's not enough, let's release an announcement telling people not to eat Tide Pods, right? And in case that's not enough, we'll hire some celebrities. They'll shoot public service announcements telling people don't eat Tide Pods. And so this makes a lot of sense, right? Many governmental organizations would do the exact same thing if this was a situation. You want people not to do something, you tell them not to do it. And so Tide thought that would be it. They put these announcements out. They hoped that it would stem interest in the Tide Pod Challenge. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. It wasn't that the ads didn't work. In fact, not only did they not work, they actually had a boomerang effect. Searches for the Tide Pod Challenge went up over 400% after these messages came out. Visits to poison control went up as well in the next 2 weeks. Over 2 times the number of people came into poison control that had in the 2 years prior. Essentially, a warning became a recommendation. Right now, this is a silly example. Most of us are never going to be in the situation where we're telling people not to eat Tide Pods. But I think it's an example of a much broader phenomenon, which is the idea of reactance, right? When pushed, people don't just go along, they push back, right? Whether we're trying to get people to do something like wear a mask or get vaccinated, or not to do something like not to eat Tide Pods, our tendency is often to push them. Our tendency is to say, look, let me give more facts, more reasons, more information. If I just push people, they'll come along and go. But unfortunately, often, not only does pushing people not work, it often backfires, right? Because people want to feel like they have freedom and control. Right? That's the idea of reactance. We like to feel like our actions, we have freedom and control of them. We make our own decisions. Why am I wearing a mask? Why am I choosing to get vaccinated? Why did I buy a product or use a service? I did it because I wanted to. Right? I make my own choices. But the challenge is that when we come in, whether when we are a marketer trying to get people to buy a product, when we are the government trying to convince people to behave in a certain way around health behavior, or even when we as scientists are trying to push governmental officials to do something, right? To take a stronger stance against climate change, to take a certain action that we think is a good idea. Whenever we push people, it impinges on their ability to feel like they are making that decision. And by the way, if any of you have kids, you're probably sitting there going, listening, oh, I've heard of this idea before. I get this, right? When I tell my 3-year-old to get their clothes on for bedtime or eat their dinner, they push back. I wish this was just true of 3-year-olds. It's also true of 30-year-olds and 63-year-olds. It's true of all of us, right? We all have this sort of ingrained desire to feel like we're making our choices. And even worse, we have an ingrained anti-persuasion radar. We essentially have an anti-missile defense system that goes off, an alarm goes off, a spidey sense that goes off when we feel like someone's trying to persuade us, right? When we are pitched through an ad or through an email or through a speech, whatever it might be, when we feel like someone's trying to persuade us, that radar goes off and we go, oh, someone's trying to convince me. And I engage in a series of defensive measures. I avoid or ignore the message, right? When we get a pitch in an email or text, we might delete it, a phone call, we hang up the call. Or even worse, yes, we're listening. Yes, we're sitting there. We seem like we're listening, but we're not just listening, right? We're actually counter-arguing. We're thinking about all the reasons why what that person suggested is a bad idea. Sure, you would say that I should wear a mask. Sure, you, government, would say that I should get vaccinated. But how do I actually know that's the best thing for me? Right? Because in the past, you, the government, did a whole bunch of stuff that was not in my best interest, right? I've read a bunch of articles online that suggest that, the vaccine may not be safe, or that, wearing mask is impinging on my civil liberties. And so when we try to push people to do something, they push back. And so let me pause there. That's sort of the science of reactance for a second. I'm happy to talk about solutions, but that, I think, sets up the problem a little bit, right? The government and health organizations have basically used the same playbook for decades. If we want people to do something like wear a mask or eat a certain thing, eat more fruits and vegetables, we think telling people will do it. If we want them not to do something, don't think and drive, don't text and drive, don't do drugs, we tell them don't do it. And the notion is just being direct and telling people what to do will move them in the right direction. Unfortunately, decades of research shows that's often not the most effective way to actually move people.
It's so important. I just have one more question for you, Jonah. It really leads off of this, which is the role of emotion and not just data. As you point out, that's just so important in persuasion. And many listeners to the show are scientists or engineers. They're they're most comfortable in the data and the facts. They're specifically trained not to be emotional when talking about their findings. Just let the facts speak for themselves, as you referenced. So, how do you get emotion into these sorts of discussions, particularly with scientists and others who aren't comfortable evoking it at all when they're trying to persuade?
Yeah, I'll say a couple things. First, the data doesn't speak for itself. Because and many scientists, and by the way, I am a scientist also. I have a PhD. I've written over 50 articles in academic journals. I always sit there and I go, oh my God, I love this project. I love this paper. Not all of them, but having multiple papers, like having multiple kids, you certainly have your favorites. And sometimes I go, man, this paper is going to have such an impact. So many people are going to read it. So many people are going to find it valuable. And then I publish it and nobody reads it, or 5 people read it, or 10 people read it. Unfortunately, I'm not alone. That happens with a lot of science, right? Many of us as scientists just think, wow, the science is just so convincing. The ideas are just so convincing. People will read it and it will change their mind. And let me tell you, it won't. Right. Unfortunately, people don't have enough time not only to read everything that's out there, but to read academic articles. Most academic articles, I'll pick on my own for just a minute, though I'm sure we can all pick on our own, are very hard to read, right? They're written for a specific niche audience. They're written for other academics who have worked in an area before and have an understanding of the background literature. They're long, they're nuanced, all of which make them great as an academic article, but often make them really hard for policymakers and other people to understand. And I've worked with enough sort of folks that deal in science communication. Oh, some people say, well, yeah, great. We're not going to have people read the paper. We'll distill the academic paper into a white paper that'll be easier to read. But then if you actually look at how easy to read that white paper is, it's never as easy to read to a layperson as we might think. And, I often talk about doing the grandmother test. Can your grandmother understand, or, elderly parent understand what you're talking about? If not, right, it's probably going to be really hard for them to remember what you're saying and to share what you're saying. And sometimes I work with scientists and they say, but hold on, isn't that dumbing down the science, right? Isn't that, that's not right. That's missing all the nuance, right? Our idea is much more complex than that. But if you can't say something simply, not only do you not understand it well enough, right? But it's going to be really hard to get other people to take action based on it. And so whether it's emotion, whether it's stories, whether it's concrete examples, don't think of them as covering everything you're doing. Think about them almost as an advertisement to what you're doing. Think about them as an appetizer to what you're doing. The idea is not to convince everyone with that one story or anecdote. It might, by the way, which is great. But the idea is to interest them in learning more. Right? Because if you turn them off at the door with too much information, they're not going to read the whole thing. You need to figure out a way to sort of ease them into the process to make them want to listen. And so, we've done a lot of work about what makes more effective writing and language features that make things more impactful. But I think the key is, we can't assume that our audience is going to take the time to read through all our details. We have to figure out how to pitch it to them. And I think, so often in the scientific community, people say, oh, well, why aren't people smarter? Why aren't people more careful? Why aren't people, why are people so easily swayed by emotion? People need to change. And look, I agree that it would be great if people changed. It would. It would be wonderful if people spent more time reading science and more time listening and more time thinking deeply about what's being said. But I think we've all lived on this earth long enough to know that people probably aren't going to change. It's not going to be like overnight, someone's going to snap their fingers and everyone will change. And so we have to do the work, right? We have to figure out how to make our ideas and the things we're pitching tastier to make them more impactful. And so I'm happy to talk about a couple of ways to combat reactance if it's useful, but I think really the onus is on us, right? As scientists, as communicators, we have to figure out how to make our stuff impactful. We can't assume that other people are going to change.
So true. And sometimes I talk about it's the trailer of the movie that you want to tell people. You don't want to tell the entire movie. Get them interested to go to the theater or actually to stream it, right? But it's the trailer we're talking about here.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, right? It's like, you may have a wonderful book, but if the first couple pages aren't engaging enough, people are going to go do something else, right? It's the hook at the beginning of the article that keeps them reading the rest. Yeah, I love that analogy.
If there's one thing, Jonah, as people, go about their day after listening to this episode that you'd like them to carry forward, of course, everything you're saying is so applicable to scientists and engineers who want to get their information out there, maybe affect policymakers. Any other sort of closing thoughts that you'd like to offer?
Yeah, I mean, I think when communicating ideas, first of all, when creating ideas, it's great to think like a scientist, right? It's great to think about detail and nuance and all the hard work that scientists do. What I'm not saying is that our work is bad, that we should stop doing careful work, that we should stop being driven by principles of science in driving our work. Nothing else should drive our work. Science should drive our work. The results, the truth, the reality that's out there is what drives our work. As a scientist, I often think of being a scientist as like almost like building an ice sculpture, right? It's like you chip away a little bit and you brush it off, and it's not a perfect sense of reality, but you work harder, and the next time it gets closer and closer, and eventually you reveal a sculpture. And so I'm not saying that we should pervert or change the scientific process as research is done. But what I'm saying is you should separate the creation of science from the dissemination of science. And the tools and techniques that make you a good science creator, science doer, may not necessarily make you a good science disseminator. People often talk about something called the curse of knowledge. Right? What is the curse of knowledge? Basically, when we know a lot about something, we assume that other people know just as much. That's why it's a curse, right? We have knowledge. If you're a scientist, you know a lot about a space, but you assume that other people know as much as you do about that space. And unfortunately, that's rarely the case, right? Because if you're an expert in the field, you know more than 99.9% of people about that area. Most people don't know what you know. But the challenge is, because of that curse of knowledge, we speak in shorthand and use acronyms and do all these different things that make it hard for our audience to actually hear and act on what we're saying. And so I think we need to separate sort of the creation of science, which we're all very good at, from the dissemination of science. When we think about disseminating science, we need to focus on our audience. Who is our audience, right? What are we hoping to get them to do? And what are the barriers in the way? How do they understand information? How can we communicate in ways they can understand? There's a great book some of your audience may have already read, called Made to Stick, written by Chip and Dan Heath, which is all about why people remember information. Great book kind of about how we communicate things in ways that are memorable, using simple, unexpected, concrete information, for example. We need to think about our audience. We need to stop thinking about ourselves. We need to stop thinking about the science itself, start understanding our audience, say, okay, great, how can I meet them not only in the middle, right, but even closer to where they are at the moment. Imagine when people communicate stuff to us, right? Imagine when we talk to a mechanic or a financial advisor, a domain that we maybe as scientists might know less about, right? When they talk in gobbledygook, when our financial advisor, mentions all these terms that we can't understand, we ignore them and we're less likely to implement the recommendation. When the mechanic says a whole bunch of stuff we can't parse, we don't end up getting the repair because we don't know what they're saying, right? And so we need to think that way as a scientist. We need to flip our role and stop being a talker, think about the listener, put ourselves in their shoes, and really use that to help understand how to design our communications in ways that'll be more impactful.
Such great advice and insights, Jonah. I knew this was going to be a wonderful conversation. And your latest book, The Catalyst, it's fantastic. I'd encourage all listeners to pick it up, download it. I just finished it, loved it, and then take a look at Jonah's other books. Jonah Berger, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to come talk to us. It was really amazing, and we could spend obviously this is a huge topic, and you're such an expert, and also an expert, of course, in making it engaging and understandable and accessible. So thank you for doing what you do.
Oh, no problem. Thank you so much for having me. I hope folks enjoyed the book. If you want more information, there's a bunch of free resources on my website. So, guides to lowering the barriers to change, to making information more spreadable. Feel free to check them out. And if there's any way I can help, certainly let me know.
And we'll put the website and all that information into the show notes that accompanies this episode, so you'll have that. Jonah, thanks again. And listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.